All right, so when we start, you mentioned your view of the Word, the Logos, as God's self-expression.
Yes.
So how do you then interpret in John 1:1 the precise Greek expression there that clearly the Word is separate from God, and yet what God was, the Word was. So this separate facing seems clearly to be speaking of a distinct being.
I don't think so. And at Cambridge, they don't think so. And, of course, we cannot take our time to read out masses of quotes. Let me just give you Colin Brown at Fuller. To read John 1:1 as though it says in the beginning was the Son is patently wrong. It doesn't say Son, it's the Word. So Jesus is what the Word became, not one-to-one equal with the pre-existing Word.
Right. No, I don't say that it says Son. I say it's His Word for reason. And, of course, get into that in depth.
Okay.
But I'm talking about the second phrase, the Word was with God. There is clearly a distinction of persons there.
Absolutely.
There is a being separate from God.
I wouldn't say it's a being. Wisdom is also with God. It's very easy for a Hebrew to speak of the Word of God, his mind and thought and plan as with Him. We find that often in the book of Job. All
right, and you have no problem with saying about this in personal wisdom, okay? In fact, in the Hebrew concept, it would be an abstract concept that is now personified.
Exactly.
But you have a problem now with saying in Him, in the Word, was life, and that life was the light of men. Again, to speak of life being in wisdom as opposed to life being in a person seems to be really pressing the text here.
I would say that light was dwelling with God in Daniel. Light and wisdom are all, I agree with you, personifications. That personification of God's marvelous character walked on the earth in a 6-foot sandaled shoe.
Okay, I mean, I understand your view on that. Yeah. To me, it's such an unnatural reading of the text here, just to be candid, in terms of the personality of the Word, even how Philo used the Word in a very personal sense, etc.
Philo does, I agree with you. You've read James Dunn's Christology in the Making, I'm sure.
Yeah, I mean, not cover to cover, but yeah.
It's terrific stuff. My own cousin, J.T. Robinson, the Babington Lecture, he goes into all of this, and of course, masses of other folks. You and I.
Right. No, I'm aware, and just even surveying the scholarly literature leading up to this, you may have a quote here and there, but the overwhelming quotes are going to be going in the other direction, and I believe for good reason, based on the Greek and its Jewish context. Okay, so
let me ask you about logos. Why do you say the logos is a he rather than an it? All things are made through it. All those translations before the King James, and 50 of them since that time, translate all things are made through it, which gives you a very different sense, doesn't it?
Oh, I'm happy to say it's through the Logos, and I explain why this is how God communicates to us and reveals Himself to us. I have no argument in that, and I think I get into that at length in Volume 2 of my series on answering Jewish objections to Jesus. So, okay, as we move on, and I'm trying to clarify and highlight some issues.
We're actually agreed on what you just said there. God reveals through Himself. The Word is the agent of Himself. And that becomes eventually a son. He spoke in the past in many ways. Now in these last days spoke through a son. Thank God.
So then, in some real way, then God incarnates Himself in our midst.
He incarnates His wisdom, absolutely.
Does He incarnate Himself?
In some sense, yes, of course. The Word is what the wisdom of God became. That's quoting Doppelt and Dunn and others. Yeah.
Okay, so in a real sense, God incarnates Himself.
Yeah, Jesus
not just
is
His person, but
of Yahweh,
Himself
absolutely.
in our midst.
Yes.
So if God incarnates Himself in our midst, then in some sense, the Son, or this one who comes to be known as Yeshua, Jesus, is divine.
Of course. I'm
not an incarnation of God in that sense.
No, of course not. He is an incarnation of the Word and the wisdom of God, and therefore an incarnation, an expression of God, but not the Son. The difference between us is that pre-existing Son, and some of your colleagues don't believe in the pre-existing Son.
No, but I'm just pressing in on this one point with 30 seconds before our next break.
Yep.
Okay, that in a real sense, God incarnates Himself in Jesus.
I agree with that.
Oh, okay. Well, if you agree with that, then in some sense, Jesus must be divine if He is a divine incarnation.
Yeah, the word divine is a little slippery, as you know. If you mean He's the one God of Israel, no. Is He divine? Of course. in a secondary sense. I mean, that word divine is hopeless. We don't even know between ourselves what we mean by it. But sure,
okay,
the Logos
but
is now
you would
flesh,
say that some way, and then we'll come back to this after the break and pick up some other sun-related passages, that in some way God incarnated himself in Jesus.
Can I make one point about Moses? According to Philo, Moses is the empsychosis, the embodiment of God's forethought. I would say that Jesus is the full embodiment of God's whole ultimate plan and purpose.
Right. Again, though, the fact that the fullness of the Godhead dwells in him bodily would be outrageous to a first-century Jew, if not for Jesus being pre-existent and beyond normal human, even your terms of who he is. Obviously, the debate about pre-existence is a very big one, and that to me is the more mind-boggling one, the denial of pre-existence. I understand how it's consistent from your viewpoint, but and of course I've read what you've written on this, but let's flesh this out. We're beginning in John 1:15. John testifies concerning him, John the Baptizer. He cries out saying, "This was he of whom I said, he who comes after me has surpassed me, because he was before me." He would say before could simply mean having priority or preeminence over.
Absolutely, and so did Calvin.
Okay.
And others.
So,
I mean, there's a long history of protos mu, and I'm using the modern Greek pronunciation because that's what we've chosen to use. I'm not mispronouncing Greek. But protos mu evidently can mean he was my chief. He's gone ahead of me because he was always my superior. Even Leon Morris commentary says
so you would disagree then, say, example, with Craig Keener and a host of other scholars who say contextually, because of what John's saying, the one who comes after me has surpassed me because he is before me.
I disagree with that as a translation, absolutely. And so do many.
Right. No, but okay. So you're saying that contextually you do not believe that this means before me, meaning pre-existed before me?
No, because he was 6 months
Could you see that as a potential translation and contextually logical, because it follows he who comes after me has surpassed me because he came before me?
Well, I agree with Calvin even, who says, he who was behind me has now moved ahead of me, onen in the Greek, has moved ahead, has become ahead of me, because he always was my superior, my chief.
All right, so when I'm just reading this contextually, and I'm seeing that this word who's now being referred to was in the beginning, okay?
Of course.
And he was with God in the beginning.
It was
and
with God,
the word was made through this Logos, okay?
Yes.
He came into the world that was made through this Logos. The world didn't recognize him, okay?
Right. Yes.
Then John says he was before me. That's quite logical to say he was before me from the beginning. I mean, that's John's whole point leading up to this.
Well, if you've assumed that the Son is pre-existing, of course, but that's the issue.
No, the word, the one he's talking about. The one he's talking. So who is John talking about here?
He's talking about Jesus. Who came, he was leading Jesus. He was ahead of Jesus as a forerunner. And this one has now gone ahead of him, as he rightly should, because he was always the superior to John, of course.
But it is this Word who became flesh who is Jesus, agreed?
Yes, of course.
And this Word who became flesh who is Jesus is the one through whom the world was made, which is repeated several other times in Scripture, and is from the beginning. Therefore, the most logical translation is before me.
I see what you're
doing. I mean, he's talking about the same. See, here's the distinction I think you're making, which to me is one of these. Again, with all respect, sir, and I mean that, because I know you've done your homework and studied here, and which is one reason I asked you to come on the broadcast.
Yeah, of course.
I thought you could represent things fairly. Yeah. The context, this word in the beginning, through whom the world was made, through which the world was made, becomes flesh in Jesus and was prior to John.
Of course,
I mean,
you're making an assumption there's some there. You're disagreeing with a whole lot of comments. That's fine. We'll disagree on that particular one. Let's go back to other parts of the Bible to set this whole thing up. Can we do that too?
Okay. So tell you what. Let me press one last point. We come back.
Yes.
You started. Okay.
Yeah.
In the same context, then we have just looking at John 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, about 8, 9 references in John.
Yes.
Jesus being the one who comes down from heaven. 1 Corinthians 15, 47, the second Adam is from heaven. This would certainly be in keeping with pre-existence. Philippians 2:6, that he was in the form of God, etc., and took on the form of a servant. Again, you deal with all these verses.
Of course.
John 17:5, I know you're going to quote one or two that differ with this. But the
well,
Oklahoma
Augustine and Calvin's theologian for a start, who see predestination there. That's all.
That's perfectly fine. But it's. I know you're quoting these to tell Christians you're not alone in these views.
Well, that's exactly
quite secondary. Right, it's quite secondary in terms of exegesis to me, especially, and then scales. But all the verses then that say comes down from heaven, the one who came down from heaven.
Yes. We'll deal with all of them as you allow time, of course. Yes.
All right. That's so let's just focus on that one. That he's the one who comes down.
He came down from heaven. Everything by way of a good gift comes down from heaven. James says it twice. We're reading this as Westerners. Coming down from heaven has nothing whatsoever to do with saying that you were alive in heaven before you came. His flesh came down from heaven, John says. You don't believe his flesh came down from heaven, literally.
Where does it say his flesh came down from heaven?
John 6, you'll find the bread, which is his flesh, came down from heaven. Clearly a metaphor. Every good gift comes down from heaven. John 6,
right, so all the other verses, though. By the way, I'm reading it through as Jewish first-century eyes as I possibly can.
Right, we're all trying to do that.
And if he just... Right, so...
Yes.
Again, that's to me is one of those things that strikes me as a special plea.